professors and gentlemen, and members of the Subcontinental Government of Malaysia. I'm indeed privileged this morning to chair this session. Talk on governance, and the panelists are very distinguished too. And definitely, we will definitely listen to very good discussion on topics very important to the country. And good governance is very, very good topic. I'm very interested in the topic. All of us are, I think. And the theme of the new government is New Malaysia is to ensure that there's good governance in the future. Issues related to transparency, accountability, zero corruption kind of thing. These are very issues. They are issues very deep to our heart, and this is the way to take Malaysia forward. I don't want to elaborate on the biodata of our speakers. They are very distinguished. The biodata are in the book. They are very distinguished, and quickly just to say, Professor Jomo is Professor of Economics who has served in the nation. And Cruz and Abidin has been chairman of India's NGO, which is very outspoken and something to look forward to. Very important NGO in the future. And finally, we have a banker, very important banker in Compton from the CIMB. So we get a good kind of a array of topics and issues to discuss, hopefully. And I've discussed with two of them. We have agreed that the professor will speak first. So without further ado, let me invite Professor Jomo to make his presentation. Prof?
Assalamualaikum and good morning to all. Thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I'd like to thank the chair for his very kind and generous introduction. But as we have very little time, let me get straight to the point, if I may. I think let me first tell you what I'm going to try to do in the next few minutes. First, I think it's very important for us to understand the origins of what is called the good governance approach to development. And the second thing I'll try to do is to outline very briefly what it's claimed to be the good governance approach. Thirdly, I'd like to quickly go through some of the implications of this approach. And then finally, I would like to conclude by advocating what I call good enough developmental governance. This is not terribly original. Good enough governance is something advocated by Mary Lee Grindle from the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. If I may quickly move on, I think it's useful for us to begin to think about the good governance approach as implying that there is somehow or other a single best model of what is considered to be effective government. In other words, it implies a one-size-fits-all approach. And in my view, that it is very doubtful that such an approach actually exists. Most models do not stand up to any serious critical scrutiny. Now, moving further, I think it's useful for us to recognize that the basic assumption is that all governments are untrustworthy. It is not possible to improve governments, to improve accountability, to improve checks and balances. Governments and people associated with government, both politicians as well as bureaucrats, are presumed to always be predatory, self-serving, first and foremost. So this basically assumes that all administrators and politicians are basically pursuing self-interest, and hence we cannot trust the state or any political processes to try to improve the human condition or the national condition, as the case might be. The major dilemma in the logic of this argument is who will bring about the desired reforms. And so this is entrusted to what is called a technocratic bunch of leaders. And you basically try to insulate the leaders by all kinds of devices. For example, you have an independent central bank, you have an independent fiscal board, independent this and that, who are basically accountable to nobody, and basically they operate out of the political system, of the self-serving politicians, the self-serving bureaucrats, as well as other vested interests. Of course, this is something which never really happens in practice, but this is the claim of how things will be achieved. Now, let me let me continue by basically saying that this approach was basically an approach which has become popular since the 1980s. As you all know, Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan were very, very influential in terms of fundamentally changing the economic discourse in the world. Those of us who are slightly older, who grew up learning about Keynesian economics and the role of the state and so on and so forth, were basically rejected. And accompanying that rejection of Keynesian economics was also another rejection of development economics, that there was nothing particularly different about economic development challenges, and all you need were basically so-called market solutions. But then, when this happened, when the market solutions were introduced, things didn't really get better. For example, if you think about what happened under Mrs. Thatcher with the privatization policies, the privatization policies actually resulted in a great deal more what might be termed rent seeking and so on and so forth. There's only one successful case of privatization, according to the various studies I've looked at as far as Britain is concerned during the 1980s, and that's the privatization of a company called National Freight. National Freight, which was involved in ESOP, an employee share ownership scheme, and that was, of course, quite successful. And so the truckers began to own the company, and they did quite well. But there are no other successful cases of privatization by the various criteria which were enunciated by Mrs. Thatcher and her people. As far as Malaysia is concerned, you might think about what has happened as far as privatization is concerned. There have been a lot of debates about it, but I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a successful case of privatization. And if you think about the privatization from the late 1980s and particularly the early 1990s, I'm sure you will agree that most of them were abject failures, and they required bailouts. The main bailouts following the Asian financial crisis were really for those privatized companies. So you basically have an approach which claims that promoting markets and private property will basically will succeed in fulfilling human needs. And of course, in my view, this is really not true. Firstly, as far as promotion of markets is concerned, this is often compromised, because the reality of the world today, the reality of the world since the middle of the 19th century, is a world of oligopolies and oligopsonies, if not monopolies. So you have a world where you do not have the world of the neoliberal assumptions in existence. Of course, the Austrian school has a variation of these arguments, and it's important for us to recognize the different views of the Austrian school as far as that is concerned, but let us not detain ourselves there. But what is often very, very important is the strengthening of so-called property rights. I am a failed student of the law. Okay, I tried to study the law, and then my father passed away, so I gave up my law studies. But when I was trying to study the law, I began to realize the subject I feared most was land law, English land law. For those lawyers here, you will begin to realize that the laws were always circumscribed. I mean, the rights, property rights were always circumscribed. If you had a huge piece of land and I was trying to move my sheep from one side of the piece of land to the other side, I had the rights to cross that piece of land. It wasn't an absolute right where you could close off access to that land. And likewise, the late Eleanor Ostrom, the only woman to ever win the Nobel Prize in economics, she was much maligned by a whole bunch of people when she got the prize. But Eleanor Ostrom pointed out that the so-called tragedy of the commons is not inevitable. Not everybody, human society is quite capable of finding solutions so that you do not exhaust a common resource. The conflict often comes about, as you all know, for example, if you study the Darfur case in the Sudan, because you had farmers demanding a lot of land, of limited land, and pastoralists who also needed land to graze their animals. So the conflicts came about because of the inability for two different types of societies. And so is perceived, of course, as an ethnic conflict and so on and so forth. But at root, it was because of the different relationship of the ways in which they sought out living, they eked out a living, and the relationship to limited resources, particularly land, and very importantly, in the case of the Sudan and Darfur, the question of water. So I think we need to recognize that human society has managed solutions, and that the most efficient way, for example, of dealing with what neoclassical economists would call externalities is not necessarily through assigning more and more property rights. And we see huge problems now with the abuse of intellectual property rights, for example. You all know the case of Martin Shkreli. In the case of Malaysia, for example, there are almost 500,000 people who suffer from hepatitis C, but fortunately, the Minister of Health has made a deal with the Egyptian supplier of generic medicines, and we have the treatment for hepatitis C, which costs 1,300 ringgit. The US solution from the original company would cost almost 300,000 ringgit. Okay, that's the kind of difference, and it's completely arbitrary, as was demonstrated in the case of Martin Shkreli. You remember this chap who bought the rights to a medicine. It was selling for $13 US dollars 50 cents, and he unilaterally raised the price to $750, 60-fold. Okay, and there was nothing to do. There was nothing which could be done. So the last Attorney General of Obama, the same lady who started the investigation of 1MDB, she prosecuted him, but she couldn't prosecute him for price gouging, because there's no law against price gouging. Okay, it's completely left to the seller to determine what price he or she wants to sell the product at. So she couldn't, and she finally prosecuted him successfully, and he's now in jail for, guess what? Financial fraud, for running a Ponzi scheme. Although Loretta Lynch started trying to prosecute him for price gouging. So if I can come back, I think we have a situation where governance reforms which ostensibly seek to introduce good governance would end inefficiency, it is claimed would end inefficiency, would end corruption, arbitrary rule, and all kinds of good things which we all basically would like to see. The next point, I think, to reiterate an earlier point I made, is the whole question of what is called the Washington Consensus. Just to refresh your memory, because many of you are young, the Washington Consensus refers to a shared worldview which emerged during the 1980s between the institutions of state, the US institutions of state, namely the White House, the Congress on the one hand, and on the other hand, the World Bank and the IMF. So there was this so-called Washington Consensus, which of course has been greatly discredited since then. But that Washington Consensus basically put forward this kind of view, which I described earlier. And the whole challenge then of good governance was to address what are called market failures. Okay, so it was recognized that simple market solutions were non-starters. They were bound to fail. So you recognize that there were market failures, and so governance became, and then of course you bring about institutional reforms to make markets work better. It was believed that there were things which are obstructing markets from working effectively, and the whole purpose of good governance reforms was to make markets work better. Now, this basic view continues to be very influential, although the Washington Consensus in its original formulations and early reformulations has been greatly discredited. But this view nonetheless remains very influential for us to this day. So the basic argument was that you bypass politics, which is presumably rent-seeking, and you basically bypass bureaucrats who are self-seeking as well. And you go for your technocratic authority, insulated from what the late Manker Olson called distributional coalitions. Now, moving further, I think it's useful for us to think about the examples of good governance which are often cited. And I think it is very important for us to recognize that, in fact, it is very, the examples are very, governments are actually very different. And it's very difficult to simply replicate something which exists, let us say, in Sweden or whatever country we consider to be the best country, even if there are some simple examples, because context matters, history matters, circumstances matters, conjuncture matters. So widely used indicators, such as the World Bank's World Governance Indicators, are often acontextual. They are often devoid of understanding the history of certain things, and this becomes very problematic. So, so basically, what we find is that almost by definition, if you look at the different indicators, whether it's the World Bank or the OECD, you will find that all developed countries are almost by definition have good governance indicators, whereas developing countries are always lacking. Okay, whether it's China, which has been growing at breakneck speed, or India, or whatever other country which has been doing well. Okay, so you find a strong association, and frankly, it shouldn't surprise you, because in fact those reforms come about precisely after you have achieved, you have brought about the kinds of reforms which are needed. So government's indicators should not be, cannot be, they do not help us to distinguish, for example, between developing countries which are doing well, okay, let us say China or other countries, say Malaysia during the early and middle 1990s, and countries which are in the doldrums, much of sub-Saharan Africa during the last 2 decades of the 20th century, for example. You can't tell them apart by looking at good governance indicators. They are not a guide to understanding what is happening. So it is important, therefore, for us to recognize that if you're trying to reform a country, it is important to recognize the very specific challenges which are involved with the country. Simply introducing what are so-called best practices does not make sense if the context is different. Best practices are always practices which come out of a particular context. You can abstract all you want in an intellectual fashion, but it does not necessarily mean that you will be able to achieve the outcomes which are considered to be desirable. So what we need to appreciate then is that you really need an appropriate governance approach. You need to begin to realize what are the kinds of reforms which are needed. You need to prioritize, and as I'll mention later, you have lots and lots of so-called good governance indicators, and you don't have much guidance as to what is urgent, what is necessary, what needs to be prioritized, and what can come about later. So certainly this good governance approach would reject Deng Xiaoping's advice to cross the river by feeling the stones. What you do is you have a big bang, and after the big bang, this will all will be well. And this is basically what's his name, Jeff Sachs advocated with his shock therapy during the 1980s and the 1980s and 1990s. Now, so simply transposing what are considered best practices can actually undermine development. And this, I think, is very important for us to recognize. You can, of course, it might seem counterintuitive, but when you think about it, it should not be counterintuitive, because if you introduce a reform intended for certain purposes, it doesn't necessarily mean those intentions are going to be realized just by introducing that reform. So basically, we need to get away from best practice approaches, so-called best way approaches, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm going to run through the so-called quality of government indicators. Very often, you have a lot of things which are considered to be attributes of good governance, and these are so broad that they become quite meaningless. And I think it's also important to recognize that there is a functionalist bias, and this functionalist bias leads to a tautological argument. What is good governance? Good governance is good for economic development. What is good for economic development? Good governance. So, and you get into this kind of tautological arguments in some of the literature, and eventually you'll find that good governance refers to corruption. Now, many of you know my track record on this, and I'm certainly hardly an advocate for corruption. But is that the most important thing to be dealt with in all contexts? And I think this is very important for us to begin to question. Let me emphasize that this is good. The alternative to good governance is not bad governance. Okay, nobody is advocating bad governance. Nobody is advocating corruption or any of that. Okay, but we need to begin to understand what is the nature of the corruption which occurs here. Is the nature of the corruption, for example, in this country, comparable or similar to what is the corruption is in India, or to China, or to Italy? Okay, and if you simply transpose some measure which may have been successful in India, for example, to this context, it may not work, precisely because the context is not the same. So we need to have a much more careful approach, and I want to emphasize that the empirical support for a lot of these claims which are made associated with the good governance approach is simply not there. Now, and this is now, by the way, conceded by, say, for example, Danny Kaufman, who was the great advocate of good governance approach from the World Bank around at the end of the 20th century and in the early part of this century. Now, let us also emphasize that that minimalist government is also not necessarily the solution. Okay. The approach is that, okay, you're going to have so many problems, let's keep government out of pretty much everything. In many cases, that's not the solution. And we are dealing, if you imagine a world economy in which you do not have any government at all, consider what is likely to happen. We live in a world where it's not $1 one vote, it's increasingly not one person one vote, but $1 one vote. And the consequences of that are quite serious. You can influence public policy in all kinds of ways. Justice Antonin Scalia, the late Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, has said, yes, what's wrong with corporations influencing public policy by contributing to election funds and so on and so forth. So you have very, very important philosophies which are involved here, and those of you who are lawyers or interested in questions of jurisprudence will, of course, be quite concerned about this. Moving on, I think, yes. The data which is often invoked, is much of it comes from Africa, from sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, for about a quarter of a century, from the late 1970s, onwards until the early part of this century, most sub-Saharan African economies were in very bad shape. And you find that almost all the sampling which is done to make the arguments for good governance draws heavily from sub-Saharan Africa. It does not look very carefully at questions of what happened in, say, China, for example, or other countries, Korea and so on, which have done very, very well despite doing badly on governance indicators. So you basically have a great deal of overestimation of the role of institutions, and it's difficult to disentangle direct from indirect effects. I'm running out of time. I've been signaled from the back of the room, so let me quickly try to run through some of these things. I think it's important to recognize that almost invariably, the major governance indicators are subjective measures, and I would like to emphasize in many developing countries, it is the subjective measures of foreign investors. Okay? It is not even what the domestic investors are thinking about. So you have a particular bias, in terms of what happens as a consequence of this. I don't have time to elaborate on this, so let me go forward. But this is particularly true, for example, if you look at the World Bank's doing business reports, which come out every year, which is the most cited publication of the World Bank. And it's been very, very influential all over the world. It has all kinds of biases, but nobody ever talks about the biases. Now, let me emphasize that we are not that the good governance agenda has informed and influenced the debates which have taken place over the last 3 decades. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And we have to be very clear about whether this involves questions such as whether we're talking about the rule of law or the rule by law. Okay, this is an issue which has been familiar to us in this country. And we have to think very seriously about what does it mean to have to strengthen property rights in ways which are hugely problematic, as I emphasized earlier. And what is involved in other things such as improving accountability and so on. Let me just quickly mention that there is much we can learn from history. I don't have time to elaborate on this, but I think it is very useful for us to consider what seems to work and under the circumstances in which it works, and try to understand why things work in particular contexts and may not work in other contexts. If you think about the chaebol's in Korea, does it mean that we should establish chaebol's in Malaysia just because chaebol's in Korea worked? I think we have to be very, very context specific in terms of trying to understand this. And I just want to emphasize once again that the empirical evidence for a lot of these arguments is really quite dubious for the reasons which I have hinted at earlier, and I don't have time to elaborate now. And so, what does this mean in terms of reform implications and implications for reform, and what are the priorities? There's really no robust empirical evidence, as I suggested, for the usual good governance claims and recommendations. Just to give you some sense, the World Development Report in 1997, more than 2 decades ago, said there are 45 aspects of good governance. By the year 2002, just 5 years later, the World Bank's list had gone up to 116, and by the time I did my book called "Is Good Governance Good for Development?", the list had gone up to over 150. Okay, the list can go on because it is, if you say that if you have a list of, let us say, of 150, okay, and things don't work out as you promised, you can always find out of that 150 a couple of things you didn't do, and say blame the failure of your reforms to work on those 2 things which didn't work, which you didn't achieve. It's very easy to do that, and that if you trust that kind of empiricism, you're not going to get anywhere in terms of understanding the reform process and the importance of reform process. So let me conclude now by emphasizing that what Mary Lee Grindle recommended, that what we need is not good governance, but good enough governance. And this implies a much more realistic, much more pragmatic, and much more nuanced and, importantly, sequenced approach towards bringing about reforms, including institutional reforms and enhancing governance capabilities. Governance capabilities are not the exclusive preserve of government. There are others which are other governance capabilities which are very important. It has to be realistic, and very importantly, we need to understand what are the priorities, what are the preconditions, and the trade-offs. And it implies acting on what is considered to be important and more important, and very importantly, achievable. So, in other words, what I'm pleading for is what may be termed developmental rather than good governance. It doesn't mean that nothing is to be learned from the good governance literature. There's obviously a lot to be learned, but I think it is very important for us to be ultimately pragmatic and begin to appreciate the strengths as well as the weaknesses of this very important literature which has come up called the good governance literature. So thank you very much for your attention, and let me end here. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Very good expose on the issue of governance. It's good to have a lecture professor to start by. Cover the historical perspective, the academic perspective, and the comparative perspective. You heard words such as good enough governance. That's great. And a lot of issues on good governance from 22 become 150, much more. And look at the Malaysian Institute of Corporate Governance, a lot, getting thicker and thicker, the report recommendation to be observed by the public and the government. Let me heard Prof. Jomo. Let's listen to Tengku Zainal Abidin, and I've requested him to speak a bit more on the political side of it. But you're feel free to go, please. You can sit or you can. You present. Okay, fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is one of the it was only after speaking with after Prof. Jomo, I have to put the microphone down. Normally, I have to put it up. But Assalamualaikum. Good morning, everyone. Selamat Hari Raya to those celebrating. And it's this period of the year where good governance is most difficult to apply when it comes to our diet. And this morning we were talking about good governance in terms of sitting on corporate boards, right? We were talking about the onerous duties that independent directors have, and all the things that the regulators ask us to do, Bursa Malaysia, Bank Negara, Securities Commission, and the expectations of good governance when it comes to being an independent director. But I think the intent of this session is to speak about good governance when it pertains to national institutions. And I'd like to begin by agreeing with Prof. Jomo in that, this definition of good governance is something that we need to define. We have to ascertain what we mean by good governance, and I think Prof. Jomo has given a wonderful elucidation about why it's more useful to talk about developmental governance. But to me, I think we need to ask the most fundamental of questions, which is, what is the purpose of government? People have different ideas about what government exists to do in the first place, and that will affect how people then subsequently define what good government and what good governance is about. So some people think that government is there to facilitate or even lead economic development. Others might say that social well-being, protecting freedom and liberty is the most important job of government. Others would say that the most important job of government is to provide political stability, ensure that there is law and order, and ensure that there are no violent incidents or too much disagreement between citizens that might lead to violence. That is the most important job of government, some would argue. So these things make it difficult to say, to assume that when one person says this is good government, that someone else will necessarily agree. And so I entirely agree that historical, sociological, political, and geopolitical context matter when we try to determine what good governance entails for any particular country. Now, having said that, I do think that some of these indices that Prof. Jomo was talking about are useful. I think it's while we acknowledge that countries are different, histories are different, contexts are different, nonetheless, I do think that all human beings everywhere in the world want certain things. They want, the US formulation, the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. But I think all human beings in any country around the world want sufficient security. They want the ability to feed themselves and their families, to clothe themselves. They want to explore their own humanity. They want to look at works of art. They want to thrive and have opportunities to grow and explore themselves. And so, in wanting to achieve these things, different societies conceive of different paths to achieve good governance that will enable them to achieve all these things. And in Malaysia, what we have, of course, are a set of institutions that have existed out of our own histories and out of our own journey since independence and our own journey since the formation of Malaysia. We have our federal constitution, which defines us as a federation. It defines what powers the federal government has, what powers the state government has. They have the federal constitution describes what our judiciary look like. It describes how the Chief Justice is to be appointed and other senior judges. It creates the Police Force Commission and other commissions like the Election Commission. It creates all these institutions that the framers and the writers of the Federal Constitution clearly thought would achieve what they believed to be good governance at the time, even though they don't necessarily didn't use that terminology. And of course, since independence, since the creation of the country, we've also had other legislation that created new institutions also in pursuit of good governance. So the MACC, the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, can be described as one other example. So as a country develops, the political process then acknowledges that governance can be made better, and that's why these new institutions are created. And of course, in a democracy, we have the element of civil society, so think tanks, NGOs, even cultural bodies. These things are also, involved in a good governance because they express their views. They disagree where they can and how they can. And I think that's why it's very important that we have the necessary freedoms and the necessary institutions that allow this freedom of speech, freedom of expression, platforms for debate to exist. So I think that's why, as well, one of the big thrusts of the Pakatan Harapan Manifesto last year was all about institutional reform. We've had an acknowledgement, for example, that the appointments processes of many of the institutions could be made better, which is why last week you had this whole furor about the appointment of the new MACC chief, because some people said, you promised that you would upgrade the appointments process, and other people said, it's important to fill the position with someone who we know is principled and fearless first. But that's exactly the sort of debate that I think is healthy in a democracy, and healthy in a democracy that is trying to achieve better governance, as long as those platforms for disagreement exist. And although not one size fits all, I think we can gain inspiration from other countries which have similarities. To give an example, I was in Canada before Ramadan, and Canada has a population size, even though it's huge, obviously, on the map, but in terms of population, Canada has a quite similar population size to us, and Canada has 13, I think, states and territories, which is obviously similar to us, but we have our federal territories as well. And one of the things which my mission there was to talk about Malaysian institutional reform and engage with Canadian academics and policymakers. And one thing which repeated itself throughout the country, one of the many things that repeated itself, was how they organize their education policy. So in Canada, there is no federal minister of education. And I thought, wow, this is a vast country. You have no federal minister of education. Instead, education is organized entirely at the state level. The same is true in Australia, and the same is true with Germany. And so when, so I think it is possible to say that, okay, Malaysia has a federal setup, just like these countries. Surely it is right or to consider the possibility that maybe we can learn something from the way that they organize areas of public policy. And I think that is something that we can do, right? that is the value that we can glean from indices and from looking at countries with other similar structures. And of course, it's also right that Malaysia should gain inspiration from countries which are Muslim majority countries. Of course, it's right that Malaysia should gain inspiration from other countries in other parts of Asia or ASEAN. And of course, since Tun Mahathir is back in office, we've heard a lot about Japan again. And I think there's the point is the point I would make is that the value of learning those lessons is something that we as citizens and we as and our institutions should be evaluating in the open. There is, I want to stress that we acknowledge that there is no panacea. There's no one idealized solution. But I think we're all in it together. We're all trying to find out what that is, and the only way to move forward is to have the space to debate that, rather than to allow any one power or any one entity to have a monopoly on defining what good is. And so to conclude, I think we've seen the economic impact, of course, of having flawed institutions. We've seen not only billions of ringgit disappear from what should rightly be been spent for the benefit of our economy, but have also at a much lower micro scale, when you have flawed institutions, when you have corruption occurring on a day-to-day basis, whether it's with encounters with police officers or encounters with bureaucrats and trying to renew your business or have licenses for things. All of these things have a eroding effect, I think, not only on our economy, but also in trust for each other, trust in our institutions. And I think that is precisely what those of us who are seeking better governance, to avoid the term good governance, are trying to achieve. So I hope we can pick up on some of those points in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for a very good survey of the Malaysian topic of governance and institutions also. And although we didn't touch much on the political side, but I think it's good to if some fellow members who are involved want to ask this question later. Let's listen from a banker, an accountant. He's the chairman of the of the CMB group. No? He was a past president of the MIA. So let's invite Datuk Muhammad Nasir to the floor.
Assalamualaikum and very good morning. Thank you, Tan Sri Chairman, Session Chairman, distinguished panelists and participants. Selamat Hari Raya. Still we are in the Shawwal month. So we've heard two very highly intellectual presentations just now. So I am here hoping to share my views on from the aspect of business and corporate sector, why good governance is important, and also because commercial and corporate sectors contribute a lot to the country's development. So I think it's important that the business entities, companies, and all that also practice good governance. But we have heard the problem of defining good governance, because what is good governance to you may not be good governance to me, and what is good governance to some of the people may be not the best of things. So I think, notwithstanding how we want to define what is good governance, I think at the end of the day, if you are dependent on organizations or even a nation, the government, what you want to see is that your life becomes better. You live in a happy environment. It was mentioned earlier, in a good security environment, with prosperity and so on. So at the end of the day, if these things are achieved, then we assume that some kind of good governance has taken place. But at the same time, when it comes to companies and corporations, my view is that when we set up businesses, when you have corporate institutions and so on, the idea is to achieve certain objectives, certain targets, and certain vision, and so on. So, to me, what is important is whether these corporations, when they set up objectives to achieve, how well do they achieve those objectives? So at the end of the day, the success of corporations is what people want to see. And I believe that success can only be achieved if there are some kind of governance in place that helps to achieve those objectives. So my belief is that people in charge with handling governance must always work towards achieving the objectives of the corporations. So at the same time, I believe good governance cannot happen if there is no positive work culture within the organization. So in order to achieve some kind of good governance, the work culture must be headed towards achieving those objectives of the corporation. So when we talk about positive work culture, then it's important to put into place policies, procedures that will work towards achieving the objectives of the corporations. So when we talk about positive work culture, I believe that positive work culture will come when there are good values being practiced in running the operation. So how do we get good values? What is good values? Then again, this is another area where different people will have different interpretation of what good values are. So, but I believe that whatever the values you want to achieve in any organization, if you want to develop good values, then the values model should be that how do you reinforce whatever behavior that is being practiced. So at the end of the day, reinforcement of behaviors and action by all the participating individuals in the organization will help determine what kind of good values is going to be developed. So, because once you reinforce certain actions, those actions become the norms and become the attitude, the beliefs of the group of people, then this eventually will become the norm, and this is the practice. This will be practiced as values. So once you have certain values agreed within the group, then these values, like I said earlier, will help create the kind of work culture that will help provide some kind of some semblance of good governance to ensure that the company or the corporations achieve whatever the objectives were set out in the first place. But finally, I think the really important thing about providing this or coming up with these values and good work culture and so on, it all boils down to accountable leadership. I think at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. In companies, boards of directors are very important because a company will be as good as the board is, and the board will be as good as the people inside the board. So, so when we talk about accountable leadership, I think we need people who will be managing entities and so on, people who are unbiased, who are firm, who provide firm and fair leadership, people who will put on a strong emphasis on integrity, ethics, and trust, people who are willing to create good teamwork. We want to have people who instill strong discipline, commitment, and sense of belonging to the organization. We want to ensure common understanding of the vision of the organization. So these are the values that I think we need to instill within the organization. Then at the same time, in coming up with solutions to what the organization need to do to achieve their objectives, there must always be consideration for financial implication, risk involved, and so on, so that actions are taken will not be detrimental to the growth and the objectives of the organization. And I think finally, one of the important things, because I believe this is what I would like to practice also, when you are running, you are managing organization, I think meritocracy should be highly valued, and then there should be no tolerance for mediocrity. I think this is where some of the problems, when you compromise with the quality of the people that you have in terms of their ability, competency, and so on, this is when things can start to go wrong. So, in conclusion, what I'm trying to say is, to me, good governance will help achieve certain success in terms of the objectives of the organization. But you cannot have good governance if you don't start with accountable leaders who will help steer the organization towards achieving the objectives within certain values, within certain moral values, within certain best practices, though best practice. But I think it always has to be in the context of where you are, what you're trying to achieve, and so long as you are within certain moral values and so on. So I think in the context of the present day Malaysia, in terms of the whole country as a whole, in terms of nation building, let's just hope that the new leadership that we put in place appreciates about what accountable leadership is all about. Because I think at the end of the day, if leaders do not become very accountable in what they do, and we have seen so many cases of where things have gone wrong, where people who shirk their responsibility as leaders have caused problems to the organizations or even to the country that they are leading. So with that, I hope later on we can have some discussion on how we go about making sure things get done the way the stakeholders want it to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both speakers, to give such insights into the meaning of good governance. Ladies and gentlemen, we now open the floor for question and answers. Please be reminded to state beforehand your name and the organization that you're from. Thank you. Any questions? There are two mics. You can actually come up. And it's one in front here at the back.
Good morning. I'm Don Hanna, the chief economist at CIMB Bank, and a former world banker and former investment banker, and educated, wrote my doctoral dissertation on the financial collapse of Chile, which in 1980-83, which was an example of what Professor Jomo was talking about, adopting a set of market institutions that did very well for about 6 years and ended in another financial collapse. It was a precursor of what happened here in Southeast Asia much later. But the question, not for my background, but rather for the panelists, and particularly for Professor Jomo, is if we don't have a set of general principles that we think about as a choice set to apply to specificity, how do we determine from specific institutions where we go? Because if we have a sample set of one, if everything is individualized, how do we come to a conclusion about what are those, as a collective, what it is that we should focus on in order to develop? That's the first issue. And the second question is, I welcome the thoughts of the panel on how one would relate this question of good governance to the definition that Amartya Sen gave of development as freedom, particularly in the context that was put up as to those elements of those governance indicators which have to do with the political structure in which development is occurring. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanna. I'm not sure we really need some general guidelines. I did suggest that there's much to learn from other experiences, from both the positive lessons as well as the negative lessons that you have done from your own experience. And but a rich understanding, a deep understanding of history, and which involves other experiences, can provide guidance which is specific. I think the challenges of good governance in a relatively rich country are obviously quite different from those of a relatively poor country. And a high-income country like Malaysia, which is on the cusp of becoming, high middle-income country like Malaysia, which is on the cusp of becoming a high-income country, the challenges are obviously quite different. I mean, what does it mean, for example, what do we learn from Korea about, say, wage policy in this country? I doubt we will learn very much from Korea about wage policy in this country. What do we learn from a country like Japan about human resources policy in this country? Again, I doubt, but it doesn't mean that we don't have much to learn. So I do think that it is very important for us to recognize and to learn from a deep understanding of our own experiences and our own successes and failures, and also to do likewise with others. So rather than search for the Ten Commandments, we should be deeply historically informed in terms of trying to draw lessons which are relevant to the challenges of our times. And obviously, for example, we had gone through an experience of mass abuse of power, where we have not only the 1MDB fiasco, but more importantly, the huge increase not only in government debt, but also in government guaranteed debt. And this, of course, very important. But there, the challenges are manifold, because you have, for example, the question of containing that debt growth, which are quite different from the challenges of, for example, disciplining the government guaranteed liabilities which have been associated with companies which are that whole area doesn't even go to Parliament. You know, the government guaranteed that doesn't even go. So the challenges are actually quite different and very specific to our society. So what do we learn from in that particular case? So I do think I appreciate your point and your desire to search for some broader general guidelines, but I've not been very much persuaded by what these guidelines might mean. As for your second question, I think Sen has put advanced notion of development as freedom, which I believe to be very important. I have benefited a great deal from his work. But one of the important elements in Sen's approach, as you well know, is the whole question of capabilities. And very often when we talk about Sen and his notion of development as freedom, there is very little appropriate understanding, if I will put it that way, of what it means, what capabilities mean. And he has a very specific understanding of what capabilities are. And we often find people citing Sen either favorably or unfavorably and misrepresenting what he understands. So I share your appreciation for Sen if you are appreciative of him. But I think it is very important to elaborate what capabilities are in the Malaysian context. What does it mean, for example, that in the course of the second half of the 20th century, particularly in the last three or four decades of the 20th century, there was tremendous upward mobility. But today, tremendous mobility in Malaysian society. But today, there is diminishing mobility in Malaysian society. What does it have to do, for example, with the whole question of the cost of higher education? Do we have it all wrong that the credentialing process associated with degree acquisition has become warped, and we have a situation where there is a diminution of capabilities, if I can put it that way, associated with skills and so on. So these are very, very important questions to be discussed in that context, but that would be going further afield from the whole question of governance. Thank you very much.
Can I go back to this whole question of really, what should we have? A state run by the civil servants or a state run by the politicians? Because many people really believe that when we have a state, an administrative state really run mainly by civil servants, the governance was much better. That the only problem was that when you had politicians take over, then you have all kinds of competing things, because to me, really, a good state really is one in which public finances are really run prudently. Because you tax people and you must decide what you do with the money. Because if you waste the money, then I think really you're spending really recklessly and you're not running a state after. So good governance really I think should be one in which really the state is run really administratively by a good set of civil servants rather than to have it run administratively or by politicians. Can I have just your opinion? Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Dan Street, but go.
Well, it's a huge question. I think it's always about finding the right balance, right? What powers? I think it's come back to the question which I used in my introduction, right? What powers do you want to confer on politicians, and what powers do you want to confer on the bureaucracy? And also, how centralized do you want these powers to be? So I've touched on our federal structure. I mean, in my view, if you were to ask me what my normative preference would be and how we distribute powers in Malaysia, I entirely agree with you. Yes, we need a highly professional and apolitical civil service that has all the moral and ethical standards that we expect a civil service to have. But we also expect politicians to define policy based on a mandate, a legitimate and democratic mandate that they received at a general election. But I think I would add to those two things a decentralization of power, so that we have a possibility of different policies in certain areas, whether, as I mentioned, in education earlier on, but even transport policy. I'm always reminded of this ridiculous story where a bus stop could not be moved in Penang without the approval of the transport minister in Putrajaya. Now that just seems to me to reflect a completely flawed distribution of powers, right? So I think that element of decentralization, taking into account our federal structure, should be considered as well. So I don't have the right answer, but those are the three things I would prioritize.
I agree with you, Gu, because I remember in our academic environment sometimes, decision to fill a post up here, post university, and to get approval of the civil service department who doesn't know what university wants. Just go there. I'm from JPA, civil service. Listen, what I know. University, they have their own governance. Okay. Any take from Dato' Nasir something?
Based on Tan Sri's question, personally, I think we need to have a balance, like what was mentioned earlier. The problem is, I'm old enough to remember when I was very much younger, civil service used to be quite strong in influencing the direction of the country. But in the last 20 years or so, 20, 30 years, then you start seeing politicians sort of taking control of how the country is to be run. But at the end of the day, I still believe there should be a right balance. I think that the problem started, to me, the problem started when civil servants, civil service people in civil service started to lose grip of what they used to be good at. So I think once competency starts dropping, and then once they start relying on directions from politicians, this is where we are now. So I think what we need to do is to boost the civil service sector to be stronger in terms of competency and professionalism. Because if I compare to a company, to me, the politicians should be like independent directors in the board. They decide direction, the policy, and so on. So the civil service people are the ones who are supposed to run, like the management in the company. So I think if we can find this right balance, so hopefully things will be better for our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato'. Maybe Prof. Can say something?
Thank you very much, Tan Sri, for your question. I share very much. He might be embarrassed that I share his view on decentralization and the need for devolution. But let me try to problematize the question. Firstly, Tan Sri, I think the choice is not between politicians and civil servants. I think the people are important. But we have to deal with the fact that we have a heritage in this country of arguably 9 decades of ethno-populism. Ever since the British were trying to deal with the Great Depression, They were promoting ethno-populism, and they continued to thrive after that. The politicians from both government parties as well as the opposition have resorted to ethno-populism because it was the easiest way to claim, broad unity of various ostensible communities. But I think, if I may come back, let me give you a positive example and possibly negative example of what devolution can mean if we do not take the totality of the context. I favor very much a decentralized approach. I've been advocating together with my colleague Professor Wan Manan a school feeding program where all children will get food in schools. And the school feeding program is intended to improve nutrition. I don't think Malaysians take great pride in the fact that we are #1 in Asia as far as obesity as well as diabetes is concerned. And the highest levels of obesity and diabetes are actually in Putrajaya. So and also a very high level of stunting among children. So it's a very ironic type of situation which we have in this country now. Now, if we have a decentralized school feeding program, it would mean that it could mean the procurement of food supplies from farmers nearby. It would change what farmers are producing to more food products. Vegetables, for example. Vegetables and fruits are undersupplied. There has not been any increase in supply of vegetables and fruits in this country over about 6 decades, as far as we can tell. So you increase, and there will be less use of agrochemicals because the parents realize, the parents who are also farmers will realize that it is their own children who will be consuming the consequences of what they use, and so on and so forth. So you could have very beneficial outcomes in this type of involvement of parents, not only as concerned about their children's consumption, but also as some of them will be producers. So we can, but this kind of thing would only happen if your PIBG or some equivalent thereof is strengthened and is able to participate in these type of processes as Tunku Abidin suggested. But let me give you another example where devolution can be problematic. The only country until the late 20th century where there were no local government elections was the Philippines. But what happened in the Philippines? In the case of the Philippines, you have what an observer calls bossism. A local person who's elected as the mayor appoints his brother-in-law as the police chief and so on and so forth. That kind of patron-client type of relationship. And we don't want that. We don't want that to be what democracy is about. So if in the case of Malaysia, what we have had is devolution in the case of Sabah and Sarawak. And I used to be a great advocate of greater state powers for Sabah and Sarawak. But when you look at how the surplus has been abused in both Sabah and Sarawak, although with different consequences, I'm not so sure that empowering states without other reforms to the country would make much sense. So basically what I'm trying to say, and in a way it relates to Dr. Hannah's question, that the reform challenges are very, very context specific, and we need to begin to think, so there are general principles. We all want to have decentralization, we don't want to have excessive controls and so on and so forth, but it's going to be much, much more challenging than simply devolving or decentralizing and so on. So I'll give you with those thoughts, but thank you very much for the 2 questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. I pass the floor to you. Question touch 11:45.
All right. Okay. I think that is the end of this session. We will have another session after this, but before that, can the speakers stay on the stage because we'll be giving you a token of